There is a version of Janice Dean that America thinks it knows. The warm voice on the morning television. The woman at the green screen who made blizzards feel manageable and hurricane warnings feel like something you could survive. The smile that arrived at 5 in the morning and never seemed rehearsed. For more than 2 decades, she was a fixture in American living rooms at the hour when people are most vulnerable, still half asleep, still uncertain about the day ahead, and she made them feel, without ever saying so directly, that someone reliable was watching the sky for them. That version of Janice Dean is real. It is not a performance. It is not a constructed persona designed by a network. It is genuinely who she is, but it is not all of who she is. At 55 years old, the woman behind that warmth is carrying something that most of her audience has only begun to understand. Not because she hid it out of vanity or fear, but because the weight of it is the kind that does not translate easily into morning television segments or social media posts, or any of the formats we use to share our lives with strangers. It is the kind of weight that accumulates over 20 years in silence and hospital chairs in the private hours after the cameras go dark, in the space between who you are publicly and what your body is doing to you privately. This is the story of what Janice Dean has actually lived, not the headline version, the real one. And it begins, as so many real stories do, not with a single catastrophic moment, but with something quieter, something easy to explain away. Something that, in retrospect, was the first sentence of a very long and very difficult chapter. She was not born into American television. That distinction matters more than it might initially seem, because it shaped the particular quality of discipline she would carry into everything that followed. Janice Dean grew up in Ottawa, Canada in the 1970s. In the kind of environment that builds a certain type of person, one who learns early that comfort is not guaranteed and that the things worth having require sustained effort rather than inherited advantage. Canada's capital is a city of hard winters and understated ambition, and she absorbed both. The cold teaches patience. It teaches you to read the sky. It teaches you that the conditions around you are not personal. They simply are what they are, and your job is to prepare accordingly. From the beginning, she was drawn to 2 distinct forces, the atmosphere and the microphone. Weather fascinated her in the way it fascinates anyone who grows up in a climate where nature arrives without apology. But it was her voice, warm, immediate, somehow both professional and intimate, that pointed her toward broadcasting before she fully understood what she was pointing toward. She worked her way up through Canadian radio and regional television across years that the industry rarely discusses once someone becomes known. The unglamorous years. The early morning shifts nobody watched. The small studios, the obscure markets, the slow accumulation of craft without recognition. She was not discovered. She was built, piece by piece, through the kind of repetition that transforms a person who wants to be good at something into someone who actually is. In 2004, Fox News offered her a position as a meteorologist. For someone who had spent years constructing a career in the quieter corridors of Canadian broadcasting, this was not simply a job change. It was a threshold. She was stepping onto one of the most watched platforms in America, into a morning format that reached millions of households daily, into a role that demanded not just meteorological competence, but the rarer ability to make complex atmospheric science feel relevant to someone eating breakfast in Ohio or Georgia or Oregon before the sun had fully risen. She was exceptionally good at it. Her colleagues noticed. Her audience noticed faster. The nickname came almost immediately: Janice Dean, the weather machine. Later, as her presence on the network deepened and her audience grew, it evolved into something warmer and more personal: the Weather Queen. It was affectionate, earned, and entirely accurate. She had a gift for making people feel informed without feeling lectured, warned without feeling frightened. In the specific grammar of morning television, that is an extraordinarily rare combination. In 2007, she married Sean Newman, a New York City firefighter. They would go on to have 2 sons, Matthew and Theodore. The family she built was, in the most genuine sense, the one she had been building toward, a household held together by 2 people who had, both in different ways, chosen professions defined by showing up when things are dangerous and other people might rather look away. From the outside, by the late 2000s, the picture appeared complete. The career, the family, the recognition, the audience that felt, in the specific way that long-term television viewers develop feelings about the people they watch every morning, that they genuinely knew her. They did not know the most important thing. Nobody did, except Janice Dean herself, and for a period of time she had been instructed to keep it that way. It began in 2005, less than a year into her tenure at Fox News, during one of the most relentless hurricane seasons in recent American memory. The symptoms arrived quietly in the way the most serious things often do. An exhaustion that sleep could not touch, a strange numbness creeping through her thighs, a loss of sensation in the soles of her feet that she kept waiting to resolve itself and that, week after week, stubbornly refused. She was covering Dennis, Emily, Katrina, Rita, Wilma, 5 major storms in a single season, and the schedule was punishing enough that she could tell herself the fatigue was circumstantial, that the body simply needed rest, that it would pass. When the season did, the season ended, the storms moved off the maps, the numbness remained, the tests that followed were thorough and the results were unambiguous: multiple sclerosis, an autoimmune disease in which the body, with a particular and devastating efficiency, turns against itself, specifically against the myelin sheath, the protective coating surrounding nerve cells, which the immune system begins to attack and degrade. The result is a disruption of signals between the brain and the rest of the body that can manifest as fatigue, numbness, vision disturbance, loss of coordination, loss of balance, and in its more severe presentations, an inability to walk. It is a disease defined above all by its unpredictability. There are no reliable patterns, no consistent trajectories, no forecast that holds from one patient to the next, or even from one year to the next within the same patient. The specific form she was diagnosed with, relapsing remitting multiple sclerosis, means periods of active symptoms followed by periods of relative stability, a cycle that can stretch across months or compress into weeks, that can be managed but never fully controlled. She would later describe the particular texture of this uncertainty, waking up each morning without knowing which version of her body was going to greet her, whether today would be manageable or whether it would demand everything she had just to appear functional. She was 35 years old. She had just joined the biggest platform of her career, and she received, alongside the diagnosis itself, a piece of advice that tells you everything you need to know about the pressures that shape what women are permitted to share about themselves in public life. She was told in effect to stay quiet, to keep the diagnosis private. The reasoning was delivered without apparent awareness of its cruelty. No one, she was advised, wants to see a sick person on television. Let that land for a moment. A woman who had just been told that her immune system was actively attacking her own nervous system, that she might lose sensation in her limbs, that she might lose the ability to walk, that there was no cure and no way to predict how the disease would progress, was advised that her primary professional obligation was to protect her audience from the discomfort of knowing. She was not a problem to be solved. She was a liability to be managed. For a time, she absorbed that directive, not without cost, and not because she agreed with it, but because she was new and because she understood intuitively that the window of opportunity she had been handed could close quickly, and because there is a particular kind of silence that comes not from cowardice, but from not yet knowing how to translate the weight inside you into words the world will receive rather than reject. She carried the diagnosis through live shots and hurricane coverage and early morning broadcasts across years. She managed it with twice-yearly IV infusion treatments designed to suppress the immune response attacking her nervous system. Not a cure, a negotiation, a way of buying time and function. She showed up. She smiled. She told the truth about the weather. She told the truth about everything, it turned out, except the thing she had been told to conceal. And then 2020 arrived and brought with it a different kind of storm entirely. By the spring of 2020, the coronavirus had moved through the abstraction of distant headlines and into the specific reality of American cities, hospitals, and living rooms. In New York, where Janice Dean lived and worked, it arrived with particular force. And for her family, it arrived with a specificity that no public health statistic could capture. Sean Newman's parents, Dee and Mickey Newman, were elderly and living in separate assisted living facilities in the state. Mickey had served in the United States Air Force and had spent his career as a New York City firefighter, the same profession his son had carried forward. Dee had built her life alongside his across decades of marriage. They were, in any meaningful sense of the word, family. Not abstract elderly people in a public health crisis. Family. In late March of 2020, Mickey Newman died of COVID-19. 2 weeks later, Dee Newman was gone as well. They died without their family beside them. the pandemic had sealed the doors of care facilities across New York, and families were not permitted inside. The ordinary human architecture of a goodbye, the hand held in the last hours, the final words spoken in person, the presence that allows the dying to know they are not alone, was not available. The grief that followed was of the kind that does not resolve quickly, because it contains not only loss but the particular anguish of absence at the moment when presence mattered most. This alone would have broken many people quietly and completely. But Janice Dean had been doing something with silence for 15 years, and what she had learned was that silence, in the end, is not neutral. Silence has a cost, and the cost of this particular silence would be paid by people who deserve better. On March 25, 2020, New York Governor Andrew Cuomo had signed an executive order directing nursing homes to accept patients discharged from hospitals, including patients who had tested positive for the coronavirus, the very population most lethal to the elderly and medically fragile residents those facilities were designed to protect. The order remained in effect for 46 days. During that period, thousands of COVID-positive patients were transferred into facilities housing the most vulnerable population in the state. The death toll that followed was catastrophic. The subsequent handling of that toll, specifically the way the state counted, reported, and ultimately obscured the number of nursing home deaths, would become one of the most consequential public health accountability failures in recent American history. Deaths that occurred after patients were transferred to hospitals were, for a period, not counted in the nursing home tally. The effect was to make the death toll appear significantly lower than it was. Janice Dean began to speak, not as a political commentator. She had spent 15 years carefully, deliberately outside that role, but as a daughter-in-law who had watched two people she loved die in circumstances she believed were directly connected to a policy decision made by the governor of their state. She described what she understood about the final days of her father-in-law. She described the circumstances of her mother-in-law's death, a death that would not be counted in the state's official nursing home figures because she had been transferred to a hospital before she died. She said what she believed needed to be said, that behind every number on an epidemiological chart was a person, a specific, irreplaceable person, and that the people responsible for the policies that shaped those numbers owed the public a full accounting. The response from powerful quarters was immediate. She was the weather girl. She was not qualified to discuss public health policy. Her grief was being exploited for ideological purposes. The dismissals were not designed to engage her arguments. They were designed to reduce her, to collapse her credibility into a category small enough that her words could be safely ignored. It was, in a different register, the same message she had received in that hospital corridor 15 years earlier. Be quiet. You don't belong in this conversation. The people listening to you don't need to hear this from you. She had not listened then. She filed paperwork to testify before New York state lawmakers. She received confirmation that she would be heard. And then, days before the scheduled hearing, her name was removed from the witness list. Her presence, she was told, made certain people uncomfortable. The woman told not to discuss her diagnosis on television was now being told she could not discuss her in-laws' deaths before a legislative body. She went on air instead. She wrote publicly. She pushed, consistently and without abandoning the specific restraint that had defined her public presence for 2 decades, for a full accounting, real hearings, real testimony, real numbers. She was not loud. She was persistent. And persistence, it turned out, was the thing the people dismissing her had most underestimated. In February 2021, a senior aide to Governor Cuomo confirmed on a recorded call that the administration had withheld data from federal investigators because they were concerned the real numbers would be used against them politically. The death toll in New York nursing homes was subsequently revised substantially upward. The Emmy Award that had been given to the governor for his pandemic communication was returned. By August of 2021, Andrew Cuomo had resigned the governorship under the accumulated weight of multiple investigations. Janice Dean had been saying for the better part of a year that the numbers were wrong and that the public deserved the truth. Vindication is a complicated thing when the price of being right is measured in people you have buried. What she said when the vindication came was characteristically direct. It was never about politics. It was about the loss of life. About the specific, individual, irreplaceable people behind the statistics. That was always what it was about. But while the external battle was being fought and ultimately won, the internal one was making demands of its own. Multiple sclerosis does not pause for grief. It does not stand down while its host is engaged in a public fight for accountability. It does not observe the boundaries between what is happening outside a person and what is happening inside them. It continues its work regardless. The infusion treatments every 6 months continued. The mornings of private inventory continued. The silent assessment before the alarm is fully silenced of what the body is and is not capable of today. The gap between the public woman and the private experience of living in that body continued to widen in ways that were not visible to the audience watching her each morning. There is a specific exhaustion that belongs to people who manage chronic illness over long stretches of time. It is not the exhaustion of overwork, though that may be present as well. It is the exhaustion of sustained vigilance, of never fully relaxing your attention to your own body, of managing not just the symptoms themselves, but the uncertainty around them. The planning required to function publicly in a body that reserves the right to change its terms without notice. It accumulates in the private hours. It lives in the spaces the camera does not reach. She had been living inside that exhaustion for nearly 2 decades. She managed it, as she managed most things, with discipline and without broadcasting the effort. The audience saw competence and warmth. They did not see what it cost. And then, in the latter part of 2025, the costs could no longer be quietly absorbed. Janice Dean stepped away from Fox News. She communicated this directly and with the characteristic honesty that had defined her public voice for 20 years. She was taking a break. She was dealing with health issues that required rest and time. Her employers had been understanding. She would return. Before the rest began, she traveled to Rome with her husband Sean. The Catholic Church's Jubilee Year, an event that occurs once every quarter century, drawing tens of millions of pilgrims to the city in search of spiritual renewal and the particular grace that comes from physically going somewhere in search of something your ordinary life cannot provide, offered a destination that felt right. She is a woman of deep faith, not the performative kind, the kind that has been tested by real things and has held or struggled or needed tending, the way all real faith does. She described the journey as a place to begin healing spiritually. The word begin is the one that stays with you. She returned home. The healing, as it always is with a disease that has no cure, was not a line crossed, but a direction pursued. And in February of 2026, she spoke again publicly about where that pursuit had brought her. What she said was not dramatic. It did not reach for the language of inspiration or resilience or triumph. It was quieter and harder and more honest than any of those things. She said it was getting harder every day. 20 years after the diagnosis delivered alongside the instruction to stay quiet. 20 years of infusion treatments and morning inventories and public fights and private costs and grief that would have leveled someone not built the way she is built. And at 55 years old, the woman who had spent 2 decades managing this disease was telling the people who had watched her all that time that the management was becoming more difficult than it had ever been before. Those words landed differently than anything she had said before, not because they were the most dramatic thing she had ever disclosed. They weren't. They landed differently because they were completely and unguardedly true. And because the people who had watched her stand at that green screen through hurricanes and ice storms and political firestorms and personal losses they had never fully known about, understood, perhaps for the first time, what standing had actually cost. There is something worth sitting with here, beyond the individual details of one woman's life. We live in a culture that has developed a sophisticated vocabulary for resilience. We know how to tell stories about people who face adversity and overcome it. We know the arc. We know the beats, the struggle, the low point, the turning point, the triumph, the lesson. The narrative has a shape, and the shape is ultimately reassuring because it confirms that suffering is purposeful and temporary and that the story ends somewhere good. Janice Dean's story does not fit that shape. And that is precisely why it matters. Multiple sclerosis does not resolve. The nursing home deaths cannot be undone. The 2 funerals in the spring of 2020, the hands that were not held in those final hours, the specific texture of that particular grief, none of it gets better in the way the resilience narrative promises. It gets carried. It gets integrated. It gets lived with day after day in a body that has its own agenda and a heart that has its own losses and a voice that has, for 2 decades, continued to choose honesty over the easier comforts of silence or performance. What Janice Dean represents to the people watching her, to those living with chronic illness who have also been told in various professional and social contexts to make their condition less visible for the comfort of others. To the families who buried loved ones in 2020 and were handed statistics instead of accountability, to every person who has been advised at some critical juncture to be quieter, smaller, less inconveniently truthful, is not the promise that the hard things will eventually become easy. It is something more durable than that promise, and more honest. It is the demonstration that you can carry the hard things, that you can carry them publicly, with grace and without pretending they are lighter than they are. That the carrying itself is not a failure to overcome. That there are burdens the world asks you to set down for its own convenience, and that you are not obligated to comply. She is 55 years old. She has a husband who runs toward fires, 2 sons who are growing up watching their mother face things that would have silenced most people and choose again and again to speak. She has a faith that carried her across an ocean in the hardest season of her recent life, to stand in a city that has been receiving exhausted and broken and searching people for centuries and offering them, if not answers, then at least the company of something larger than their particular suffering. She has a disease with no cure and a voice that has never learned how to be quiet. And she has 20 years of showing up. At the green screen at the legislative hearing she was removed from, at the microphone she was told she did not deserve in the infusion chair, in the private mornings before the camera was on. That constitutes something the resilience narrative cannot fully contain. Not a story of triumph over difficulty, a story of continued presence in the face of difficulty that does not end. The most important forecast Janice Dean ever delivered was not about a hurricane. It was not about a blizzard or a tornado or any of the atmospheric events she spent her career tracking across satellite maps and radar screens. It was the forecast she kept delivering quietly through every year of her public life, about what it actually looks like to live inside a storm that never fully passes, and to decide nonetheless that the people watching deserve the truth about what is coming. At 55, battered by a disease that has pressed harder than it ever has before, by a grief she carries alongside her husband in the private spaces that cameras do not reach, by 20 years of being told in different languages and different settings that her voice belongs somewhere smaller and quieter and less inconvenient, she is still here, still speaking. Not because it is easy. The evidence by now is overwhelming that it has never been easy, but because somewhere out there, living with the same invisible weight, watching the same morning broadcasts and feeling alone in the particular way that illness and grief and institutional dismissal make a person feel alone, is someone who needs to know that the hard days are allowed to be hard. That saying so is not weakness. That the storm you are inside is real, even when the sky outside looks clear to everyone else. Janice Dean has been saying that for 20 years. She is still saying it now. And for everyone who has ever been told their storm was too inconvenient to mention, that is not a small thing. That is the whole thing. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who is carrying something they have been told to carry quietly. And if you or someone you love is living with multiple sclerosis or any chronic illness, know this: your visibility is not a burden on the people around you. It is a gift to everyone watching who thought they were alone.